Welcome to the Bookshelf Edit, where we break down the best books in security, risk, leadership, and management in under 20 minutes. No fluff, no filler, just the key insights that matter. Each episode, you'll get key takeaways from top security reads and decide whether you want to take a deeper dive into these topics yourself. Plus, we'll have guest appearances from industry leaders sharing their perspectives, as well as author interviews. Let's get into it. Security professionals love to talk about risk. It's our bread and butter. But let's be honest, most of us have sat through crisis management briefings where the solutions are just a fancy way of saying, be less surprised when things go wrong. What I love about this book, so much that I've read it twice now, Strategic Risk and Crisis Management by David Rubens, is that it doesn't just talk about managing crises. It forces us to re-examine how we think about them in the first place. It's not about reacting better. It's about seeing the crisis before it even forms, understanding the systemic failures that make disasters worse, and, most importantly, building security frameworks that actually work in real-world chaos. So for this episode of the Bookshelf Edit, I'm breaking down what I learned, why it matters for security professionals, and some of the case studies that really stood out. And if you've ever sat in a crisis meeting that was less coordinated response and more headless chickens with PowerPoints, this one's for you. One of the biggest mistakes we make in risk management is thinking that crises are unpredictable. We like to talk about black swans, those freak events that no one saw coming. But the reality is, most disasters aren't black swans. They're grey rhinos. Big, obvious, charging right at us, and somehow we still manage to get trampled. In 2017, the UK's National Health Service was hit by a massive ransomware attack that shut down systems, delayed surgeries, and cost the NHS millions. WannaCry exploited a Microsoft vulnerability that had a patch available 2 months before the attack. The warning signs were there. Cybersecurity experts had been shouting about unpatched systems and the risks of ransomware. But like so many security threats, it was put in a we'll deal with that later pile. David highlights how risk managers need to start thinking like grey rhino spotters. If something looks like a massive problem waiting to happen, don't wait for it to charge. Take action before you're the one getting gored. Security isn't just about reacting to threats. It's about creating a culture where obvious risks don't get ignored. So if you work in corporate security, cyber risk, or crisis management, you need a system for spotting grey rhinos and acting on them, not just waiting for an incident response team to pick up the pieces. He also talks a lot in this book about why hierarchy in crisis management often fails. Security professionals love structure. Let's be honest, we love a good chain of command. But the reality is, when a crisis actually happens, all the neat little organization charts fall apart. And the truth? Hierarchy-led crisis response systems often fail when we need them most. The 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan triggered a nuclear meltdown at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant. The response should have been rapid and coordinated, but instead, bureaucratic delays, rigid hierarchies, and a lack of real-time adaptability made everything worse. The disaster response was so centralized that lower-level responders couldn't make quick decisions without any approvals, and this led to catastrophic delays in containment efforts. David argues that in crisis management, adaptability beats hierarchy. The best crisis response teams are decentralized, able to make decisions in real time without waiting for approvals that come too late to matter. Whether you're dealing with a corporate crisis, a cyber attack, or an emergency response, If your team can't function without waiting for senior approval, you have a structural problem. Real security leaders build crisis frameworks that empower teams to act, not just wait for orders. Another point he makes is the importance of resilience and adaptive leadership. Resilience gets thrown around a lot as a buzzword, but this particular point hit me that it's not about bouncing back after disaster, it's about designing systems that don't collapse in the first place. In 2000, a major tornado hit Fort Worth, Texas. What made the response here different? The city had spent years integrating emergency management with community resilience planning, meaning people weren't just waiting for the government to step in. The response was rapid, coordinated, and adaptable because it wasn't just a government driven effort. Businesses, local responders, and community groups were already set up to act. And this is what resilience actually looks like. It's not just a disaster plan sitting in a binder somewhere. It's a framework that enables rapid adaptation in real time. So if you're responsible for risk management, ask yourself, are you designing systems that are rigid or ones that can flex when things go sideways? And security professionals should be thinking about resilience as a mindset, not just a checklist. Crisis management isn't about predicting the future. Though, wouldn't it be nice to have a magic fix and know next week's lottery numbers? But what it is about is designing security frameworks that work when things inevitably go wrong. David doesn't waste time on theory that only works in a perfect world. So this book is for people dealing with real world crises, whether that's frontline security, corporate risk, emergency response, or cyber threats. If you're in this field, you already know that crisis response is often a mess. This book is about making sure it's a managed mess, where systems, people, and leadership actually function under pressure. So if you're looking for a book that doesn't just tell you how bad things can get, but actually gives you the tools to be better prepared, this one's definitely worth your time. And if nothing else, it'll definitely make you rethink that incident response plan that's been collecting dust in your office. Now that we've broken down the key takeaways from the book, it's time to hear from the author himself. Dr. David Rubens was kind enough to let me pick his brain for you. So let's dive into our conversation on risk, crisis management, and what security professionals really need to know. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me about your book today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here, Farah.
Your book challenges a lot of traditional thinking about risk and crisis management. What would you say the biggest misconception that you see is in how organizations actually approach crises?
They don't appreciate the reality that they're facing. And I think that's especially true in the 2020s, let's say beginning of COVID 2020, but the 2020s, that we are not paying attention to, we're not respecting the realities of the changes we're seeing in the world and the environment we're operating in. We use this word resilience, and from my perspective, pretty well most people who use that are using it in ways I don't think really captures what it really means. But if you want to be resilient, there's a number of things you have to have in play. And the first thing is you've got to be sensitive to your environment. You've got to understand that you're not separate from, or you can't impose yourself on the environment, you're part of the living environment. And then when you go to the next level, you have to be aware of the changes in your environment. Because the changes in your environment is what triggers the need for us to do risk management. If there was no change, there'd be no risk. And so the ability to have the functionality to have that awareness of changes in our environment seems to be missing. And when I listen to people who have positions of power or influence, control, whether it's in cities or governments or agencies or NGOs or whatever it might be, and they try and describe the risk environment we're operating and what they're doing about it, it seems to me that their language is just wrong. Their language is linear, simplistic, isolated, boundaried, and none of that's true for the risk we're facing. And you look at crisis, you look at COVID, for example. Switzerland and France and Germany all closed their borders and had different policies on each side of their border, as though COVID really cared which side of the border we were on. There was no. So I think the number one thing is we're not paying attention to the reality of the risk environment we're operating in and the challenges that creates.
It's interesting you say that. And also, one of the things you touch on in the book is command and control structures. Would you say that organizations and even government still relies too much on a rigid command and control structure in crisis situations?
It's interesting. They would say they wouldn't. And yet we see it every single time. Certainly, we take the UK, which of course both you and I know about, in COVID. The immediate response of the UK government and the governing classes was to bring everything to a very, very, very small group of people called the cabinet, who had no experience, they had no background, they weren't prepared for that, they didn't have the skills to deal with that. Most of them have been brought in by by Boris Johnson as Prime Minister because of their loyalty to him and their belief in Brexit. They weren't ready to manage a global pandemic hitting the UK. So within our own human body, we have two responses. The first is to blink, which is the fastest muscular movement. It has nothing to do with muscular control. It's the fastest response. And the second is we raise our hands and we cover our heads. We protect our heads. And that's what organizations do. They say we will trust our people. They say that we will sort of allow people to do stuff. We will give them autonomy. And as soon as something happens, it comes back to the center and it goes back to the top. And we know that's counterproductive. We actually know that. It's almost impossible to overcome it. So I think, yes, I think that our understanding of command and control, and also that's true from the academic side. A 2001 book, Bigley and Roberts, on the incident command system described it as a hierarchical, command-centered, process-driven, bureaucratic process. And that's fine if you know what you're doing. If everybody knows what they're doing, you need that structure. The problem is when you go off piste. If you are a really good skier, then you have technique. When you go off piste, you go off country. You need a different set of skills. We need to bring that to the game as well.
It's interesting you say that, because one of the things I was thinking about was a lot of organizations have these massive crisis management plans, but when an actual disaster strikes, those plans very often end up sitting in a drawer. What do you think the biggest flaw is in how organizations build their crisis plans?
There's so many things. The first thing is they don't understand what a crisis is. Most organizations, from my experience, both from my own experience, but also working with them, when they talk about crisis, they're actually talking about major incidents. Crisis is something different. And so within their hierarchy, their taxonomy of events, what they're describing as a crisis is not a crisis. Let's take COVID. Let's see if we can play with it in the big kids' playground. Okay, let's really test ourselves out. COVID was not a crisis. COVID was not a crisis. COVID as a pandemic is only very mid-level. So the morbidity rate of Ebola, for example, Africa, Nigeria, West Africa, 2013 to 2015, the morbidity rate of Ebola is 50%. The morbidity rate of COVID is 1%, plus or minus. Imagine we'd had 30% deaths rather than 1%. So what you have is COVID was an emergency. You were supposed to have people who were medical clinicians or whatever, epidemiologists, they understand that. The crisis was maintaining the running of the UK, running our schools, supplying our hospitals, keeping things going, keeping our communities going, keeping our businesses going, keeping our economy going. But what the government did was try to run the emergency. They tried to tell people in hospitals what you should be doing and where you should be going and what sort of clothes you should be wearing. And that's a classical mistake. It's mistaking the emergency response for the crisis management. If I, God forbid, have a fire in my house, My job is to get out the way, let the fire engines, 5 people coming, that's what their job. But when they go away, now I have a crisis. My crisis, where we don't have a house, we don't have food, we don't have medicines, we don't have clothes, we don't have ID, we don't have that's a crisis. And I think that what organizations do is they mistake emergency management for crisis response. Emergency management is not a C-suite issue. Emergency management, you've got people whose job it is to do emergency management. What the C-suite needs to do, the executive committee needs to do, that's crisis management. And the truth of the matter is that in almost all cases, in my experience, they're just not ready.
Well, I think we can all agree that those in government far too often are not qualified for their roles and don't listen to qualified people often enough. One of the themes in your book is how leadership completely changes in a crisis. And you mentioned that good crisis leaders don't always come from traditional leadership roles. Why is that?
Because there's a difference between leadership and management. And in many organizations, what they call leadership is actually process management. And in many cases, it's about managing decline. It is about sort of trying to sort of lay people off and do things with not enough resources. And then you get the challenge of a crisis, which is chaotic and challenging. And of course, the problem with the crisis is there is no accepted process. Nobody, COVID. Do we go into lockdown? Do we not go into lockdown? Nobody knows. I mean, nobody can tell you they have an answer. And actually, what we should have done was said, okay, you guys go into lockdown. You guys don't go into lockdown. Let's see what happens next. And yet people said, we've gone into lockdown. It became a political battle. But there was no idea of bringing people into to have a collaborative discussion about that or a learning. Boris Johnson said, it was about 2000, so COVID started 2020, 2021. The claim says we need, in the middle of COVID, we need to have a review. We need to have an official review. What's happened so far and where are we moving? And he said, no, 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 no. This is not the time to do a review. Absolutely, that was the time to do the review because then you could learn from stuff. The government's got SAGE, Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, 56 people on that. Not a single person had a background in crisis management. Not one. They were all economists or epidemiologists or, social psychologists, which is important. But there were mistakes made, fundamental mistakes about how you run a crisis. That at the end of the day, we had 180,000 deaths in the UK from COVID. 180,000. That's a lot. That did not have to happen. Under a different narrative, that did not have to happen. The problem is these sorts of mistakes, they have consequences. That's the problem. They have consequences. You don't walk away for free.
So, what would you say are qualities that would make someone effective in crisis leadership? And how can security professionals who are going to be listening to this develop them?
Farah, there is nothing in this life you get right the first time. There just isn't. If you want to bake a cake, you only need 4 things. You need eggs, flour, butter, and sugar, whatever it might be. Simple. It's not difficult. But you can watch the video of how to bake a cake. I can show you how to bake a cake. I can explain to you how to bake. Does that mean you can bake a cake? No, it does not. And okay, you go, oh my God, that's not a cake. And the famous example was, and I've forgotten it, Roberto Baggio, 1994 World Cup in America. He had to take a penalty in the World Cup final. He'd been taking penalties. He was the best player on the planet. And he failed miserably. He could not kick that ball even anywhere near the goal. Why? Because it's not the same when it's a World Cup final and you're live in front of 2 million people live on TV. There is nothing that can prepare you for that. There's just nothing that is. So what you need to do is you need to normalize it as much as possible. And what the skills of people like myself and yourself and everybody who does this is to not solve the crisis or manage the crisis. You don't manage a crisis. You survive a crisis and you manage the after effect. But to downplay it from a crisis to a major incident. It's still there, but at least you are engaging with it rationally. And the problem with a crisis is that it is unique. Crises should always be unique. you shouldn't be having a crisis for the second time. Then that's bad. But if we can prepare ourselves to understand what that means and put ourselves in that environment so that we have a sensitivity to change, that we have an organization that is open to people making mistakes, for example. Well, you call it making mistakes, I call it learning. That's how we learn. Then we can prepare ourselves as much as possible.
I like the cake analogy. That's great. Thank you so much. And just a final question. If there's one key message that you want security professionals to take away from the book, what would it be?
Learn, learn, learn fast. As individuals, get better, invest in yourself, study, do courses, hang around good people. Don't hang around idiots. Do not hang around idiots. Hang around good people. Learn from, and then because then it doesn't matter what they do. If you've got somebody who really runs the kitchen well, hang around that person because you'll understand how they do it. But if there's one thing that we as a community, as a global community, need to bring to the game is we need to learn fast. We need to learn fast. And that's something that us as professionals need to invest in as well. And of course, that pays off. If you do read more, hang around good people, listen to webinars, and you'll find just the way that you articulate, the way you conceptualize, the way you formulate, the way you engage will change, and people will recognize that. You will be quantifiably better, demonstrably better, because you have that insight or understanding, whatever it might be. It is, you've heard me say before, Farah, it's not magic and it's not voodoo. It is just really good, strong professionals doing what they know to do in challenging environments. That's it.
So there you have it, listeners. Insights straight from the man himself. Read more, learn more, and surround yourself with good people. And I, for one, am incredibly grateful to be having these conversations and sharing them with you. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe for more security reads and expert insights. Until next time, stay informed, stay prepared, and keep building better security.